starting a church is no different than starting a new business. And so, I had years experience in taking a concept. You have a dream. Well, how do you make that dream become a reality? And let's say you have a product idea. Okay, well, it's just an idea in your head. It has to move on to paper. Then it has to move from paper into production. It has to move from production to channels of distribution. And it has to get to the end consumer. And, it's hard to understand what that pathway looks like, but it's no different than the church. What you have to do, and I'm not saying the church is a product, so don't misunderstand me there, but the planning process and implementation of something that becomes real and viable is exactly the same. You have to be willing to work the problem backwards. So you look at your concept, you look at your vision, and you begin to work the problem backwards and say, okay, well, in order to support this, what kind of resources am I going to have? What kind of relationships do I need to establish? What kind of funding is it going to require to get this off the ground? What do I need to learn, or how much more do I need to be equipped to handle this based on what I've learned? And so you can take that information and begin to plug in and develop the relationships that you need. And the cool thing about the United Methodist Church is that we're connectional. So the fact that we're connectional, we've got all kinds of resources. And if you ask the right questions, you're going to get the responses that you want. So it's a matter of partnering with not only congregational development, congregational vitality, but also working through the channels of the districts and other opportunities or ministries in the conference that can provide support, whether it's training or resources or funding or people. People is another big resource. And when you're getting a church off the ground, I think we forget about that. Well, it's not just about attracting people from the community. You also have to have a core group, and sometimes that core group has to come from other United Methodist churches that might be in the area. So that's another consideration that has to be addressed. So it's about working the problem backwards, developing the relationships that you need, knowing the community that you're in. You're going to automatically be able to align yourself with leaders in the community, business partners in the community that can assist you. It's a matter of getting out and talking to folks and let them know what's going on. And you're always casting vision. So it doesn't matter if you're in the planning process or the implementation process or the information gathering process. You're always casting vision, because there's a lot of different pieces to the equation.
Yeah, obviously there has to be some kind of funding. And that may come from a parent church or a sponsoring church or sponsoring churches that have a shared vision for reaching a certain population group. And so inviting them into participation and ownership of this would bring resources, could bring financial resources, could also bring people resources. Churches that borrow members from other congregations to serve alongside them for a year, almost like missionaries that would come from another congregation, is one way of kind of borrowing resources and even borrowing critical mass until you get to the point where you can develop your own people to do that. Funding resources, we tend to think, the conference needs to pay for this or the district needs to pay for this. It really is a both and, but I think that we do a disservice if we don't have an expectation of planters from the very beginning and train them how to raise a certain percentage or portion of their initial startup money before they begin. We can train people how to do that. We can give them the nuts and bolts of what steps to take in order to raise funds. There'll never be a time once you start a church, and I don't care if it's a house church or a wannabe mega church or an intentional community, there's always going to be a need for funding. And I think the earlier we can train a church planter to become comfortable with casting vision and making the ask, the better prepared they're going to be as the church develops, especially if they're adding staff or if they're looking at facilities or any of those kinds of things. There's never a time when they're going to get to the end of inviting people to be generous and supportive. So I think one of the resources we can offer as an annual conference is to say, we can help you, but gone are the days when the annual conference can fully fund your project.
I believe the model of a mother-daughter relationship is a great one. And I think I've had the opportunity to get to know Stephen and Ken down at Matthews, and they're doing it well. And they're doing it right for now, in this culture, in this context. And I believe having that support system of a body that gets the vision. And Williamson's Chapel got the vision. and they prayerfully supported West, which was really, really cool. People that would never want to go would get their kids excited about it. Their young adult sons and daughters that are not going to go, to the 11 o'clock worship service with their mom and dad. And so having a body of people praying and offering encouragement, verbal encouragement, especially in the community, I think that's huge versus a parachute drop where here you go, here's some money, make it happen. I think that's next to impossible actually now. But I think there are lots of ways that mother-daughter thing needs to happen and happen well.
The way that it has been well resourced is that it's something new coming out of something existing. So Matthews United Methodist Church is already a very well resourced place. For example, they had the opportunity to bring me on as a full-time clergy. So I'm a clergy of Matthews United Methodist Church, even though my main portfolio is 801 South. Matthews United Methodist Church is a debt-free church. They've been great stewards and managed their resources very well. And they actually had almost $1 million in hand, which was used to create the new space for the new venue.
I encourage church planters, especially at stakeholder meetings, when they start seeing there's a ticking clock that's always kind of in the background of church planting. And church planters should always be aware of that ticking clock, and their core members should too, especially as it relates to funding, because eventually the clock's going to go off and the money's going to stop. So looking at what other kind of funding partners can we find? Are there grants that we can write? Are there community partnerships we ought to be considering? Are there major donors who really have a heart for what we're doing that we ought to have a conversation with, invite into giving? All of those things, I think, have to be part of the conversation that gets a church to that sense of sustainability. I don't know that we ever had the luxury of planting churches. There was a time, I know, in United Methodism when the United Methodist Church or conferences would invest $2 million in a church plant. They'd buy land, they'd build a parsonage on it, they'd pay the salary of the planter, and 5 years into this thing, they'd sell the house and the land. They'd find another appointment for the planter because he started the wrong way, which is you don't start with land and you don't start with facilities, you start with people. But seriously, right now we're investing anywhere between $150,000 to $300,000 per church plant in Western North Carolina. We're going to be working on a funding strategy where we're going to significantly reduce that by developing partnerships early on. And what it does is it gives us the ability to plant more churches. Instead of 4 a year, hopefully we can do 12. But we've got to rethink how we proceed in that.
Yeah, I think that sustainability is a difficult thing for new faith communities because that is one difference here as opposed to a lot of other communities that start on such a small budget, such a limited amount of resources to be able to sustain what they're doing. But I've always been a believer that money and resources follow mission and vision. So as long as you're living into that mission, as long as you're living into that vision and you still are showing confidence in it and you're reaching people and people's lives are being changed and you're telling those stories well, that the sustainability will come eventually because people will want to be a part of it. People will learn how to reallocate their own resources for the sake of the kingdom work that you're doing.
But I believe having a supporting foundation and then money, of course, is key. And that's probably the hardest part to negotiate between the mother-daughter relationship because nobody ever has enough money, for ministry. And I do believe, however, if it is of God, that it comes. And just when I would be ready to quit every other week or so there for a while, because it was so hard and it just seemed like every time I turned around there was another hurdle. We've got unanimous support from the administrative board at Williamson's Chapel. Just no opposition whatsoever. It could not have gone better. And then the next day we called Lake Norman High School because that's where the district thought we needed to focus in that area. And another church that has it going on way more than we did at that point in time. Mega church, 3,000, 4,000 people on Sunday morning. They were going to use the high school. They had already reserved it. And I thought, oh my gosh, holy cow, there's no plan B. And so then we just took a step back. Okay, what are some other options? Because there's always options. And started pursuing other things, Queen's Landing, the piano bar, the dueling piano bar. And lo and behold, a couple weeks later, Lake Norman called. That church decided not to open a campus here. Would we like to talk? Yeah, okay, hey, And I'll never forget a colleague of mine at Williamson's Chapel saying, do you think God got you this far to just say, have at it?
When we stepped into this, we didn't get the opportunity to buy property or to live into a building. So the greatest circumstances that we had it was like planting a church with an anvil around your neck. We automatically had property and a building, but with property and a building comes mortgage. And so we didn't have any people coming out of the gate, but we still had a mortgage payment to make. And all of the financial support from the conference had been exhausted. And so we just had a little bit of money in support from the District Mission Society, which was very helpful. But if I had it to do all over again, certainly would not plant a church without the resources to support the circumstances of the plant. In our case, we had this beautiful piece of property of about 16 acres and a building, but with that comes a hefty mortgage. And so it was really like planting a church with an anvil around your neck. It took us a while to get off the ground, but once we did, we've kind of moved in the direction, got over the power curve, if you will. We've become financially stable, and we're very, very healthy. But if I had to do it all over again, I would want to live into a space that as we're growing, then we make decisions on the space that we're going to purchase or the space we're going to rent, and we just kind of live into that as we can afford to. We've been always behind the power curve here on the first 3 years, just trying to catch up with the expenses it takes to just keep the doors open. And that hinders ministry in a lot of ways. Now, we've come up with creative ways to overcome that. We've always done ministry. We've always partnered with area businesses to do ministry within our community. But that's one thing that I would change if we had to do it all over again.
And so I was getting ready to give up because we didn't have enough money to do the sound system and buy trailers and all that stuff. And Lake Norman didn't have room for us to store anything there, so everything had to be portable, absolutely everything. And we didn't have enough money. And so we were going to have to cut something. And we weren't frivolous, but $70,000 is not really enough, and to buy all that stuff. And the very day that I had just, racked my brain, how are we going to do this? Redid the budget 3 or 4 times, gotten different quotes, etc. Steve called me, one of the guys that worked with congregational development, and said, Light of Christ, which this actually goes to one of the other questions. Light of Christ is going to have a facility now, and they would like to donate their trailers to somebody that needs it. Do you need them? If so, call me. And I'm like, immediately, oh my gosh. And so my best friend that would pray for me throughout all this, she said, well, Moses, and she would joke with me that I'm not, I'm not the one, I don't have the gifts, Do you think God will ultimately provide a way for you to follow and you can overcome your own inadequacies and insecurities? She said, do you think maybe the trailers might be just a little sign from God that God's got this and God's way bigger than you are, and so maybe you need to quit thinking you've got it?